Thank you, Micheál Martin. Minister, last night Ulster Bank confirmed that they were going to close 40 more branches and lay off more additional staff. We're now looking at, in that bank alone, a loss of employment of between 1,400 and 1,800 jobs, which I think is a staggering blow to those employees and their families. Now, the Chief Risk Officer, in a presentation to investors, went further and said that they're anxious to break even by 2014 and to make a profit again in 3 years. And in that context, very worryingly said that they were going to target distressed mortgage holders in arrears. And in an extraordinary statement, he said that it was his view that up to 35% of those in arrears were strategic, and they were going after those. And he blamed the Dunn judgment in the context of the Land and Conveyancing Act. And it's interesting, Minister, that the government's response to the mindset and the mood revealed in that presentation to investors yesterday was essentially to capitulate to the bank's agenda. Clearly, the banks are targeting those in arrears, and the government has facilitated it, quite simply, by changing the legislation, bringing it through this House to make it easier for banks to repossess family homes, and secondly, by unravelling the existing protections and the existing code of conduct that was there for mortgage holders and for those in arrears. The new code of conduct represents a significant moving and rebalancing of powers towards the lender as against the borrower. And I think what we saw yesterday was a revealing insight into the thinking within the bank boardrooms and the bank managements across the board. Their belief that it's legitimate to use legal action to go after people in arrears because, sure, they're all strategic defaulters anyway. And it seems to me now that what we're witnessing here, and it explains really why the government has created a situation which coincides with the agenda of the banks in terms of diluting protections that were there for people in mortgage arrears, and by changing legislation without any conditionality at all. Thank you, Deputy. To protect those in arrears. So what I would ask you, Minister, do you share the view of Ulster Bank that up to 35% of mortgage defaulters are strategic? Is that the government's view as well? And given that mindset now as revealed by the bank, will the government reconsider intervening on behalf of those in arrears and putting in place independent oversight to arbitrate between the banks and those in arrears to make sure that people in mortgage arrears in this country get a fair hearing and get genuinely sustainable resolutions to the predicament that they find themselves in?
Margaret and Cara, Mr. Bruton.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Micheál Martin. I suppose it's difficult to take lectures from the minister opposite or the deputy opposite about capitulation to banks, given the history of what we've been through and the situation in which we're in. I think all of us in this House.
Sorry, please.
All of us in this House will express, all of us in this House will express sympathy with those who have lost their jobs in Ulster Bank, which is the initial question raised by the Minister. But I'm very much aware that this is an economy in transition, and I think we will feel for the people who are losing their jobs, but we also recognise that we are making real progress. We're seeing parts of the economy that grew too big, which unfortunately included banking and property. They are adjusting to a new reality, and we are creating employment in other sectors that are long-term and sustainable. So I think that is a part of a transition that's going on here. The Deputy also raised the issue of people who are in mortgage distress. This government has taken enormous pains to provide a framework within which such people can be protected. There is a mortgage arrears relief programme which sets out the code that must be followed. There is, in addition, we have made it very clear that the money that we, the taxpayer, have put into the banks to recapitalise and make provision for the losses that are in their loan books, they must be used now systematically to deal with people who are genuinely unable to meet their mortgages. And that has been set with targets being set for the banks to have workable restructuring programs developed for each mortgage holder, 50% target by the year end. So we are moving to deal with what has dogged many other countries who have had banking crises of this nature. A failure of banks to face up to this, a failure to allow people to get on with their lives. And I think that's what we're putting in place. There is not only the programme that I outlined, but also we've now put in place a personal insolvency legislation. And that provides people who, at the end of negotiation with the banks, if they have failed, they can go to a body, the Personal Insolvency Service, and have their case independently dealt with. So we are putting in place a number of protection mechanisms to allow people to work through, in a systematic way, these problems. Our objective is to move the economy on, to allow people who genuinely can't pay come to terms, resolutions, so that they can restart their lives, and to insist that banks use the money that has been put in at enormous cost to taxpayers to resolve the issues for individuals and businesses.
Supplementary question from Deputy Micheál Martin.
Paul, Minister, you talk about expressing sympathy. People need more than sympathy at this stage. And I asked you a very basic question. Did you share the Ulster Bank's view that that there are up to 35% of those in arrears because of strategic considerations? I don't, by the way. I think it's an extraordinary figure. Anybody who's on the doors, anybody who's talking to people in arrears, know how much they've engaged with banks, tried to engage with banks, but got no response. And since the Keane report, for example, out of 144,000 people in arrears mortgages, we've only had 144 split mortgages. That's the lack of engagement to date by the banks with people in terms of meaningful, sustainable ideas that were put out 2.5 years ago. And you talk about adjusting to new realities? New Beginnings, Minister, are saying that there's up to 50 new repossession cases before the court every month now. That is what people are now adjusting to, Minister. That's the adjusting to new realities for many people in mortgage arrears. And bank activity has focused increasingly on such people in the last 8 weeks. And that's what we're hearing on the ground. That's what we're hearing from the groups at the coal face. And the problem is there's an absolute absence of any independent oversight over the banks themselves. And inexplicably, you have changed the code of conduct and reduced the protections that were there up to a short while ago. And you've stood by and you've allowed that to happen.
Thank you, Deputy.
Which essentially gives more power to the banks to do what they want to do, to get the profitability, to target those in arrears. There's no safeguards now in relation to abuse for the potential for abuse in terms of increased contact. So that all the restrictions about contacts with customers are gone. They can harass people as long as they want to and continue to without protection.
Question, please, Deputy.
For the first time ever, tracker mortgages are now on the table. And people are getting no... The truth hurts. The truth hurts, Deputy Stagg. There is no protection now for those in terms of no independent oversight in terms of those.
Could we have order, please? A question from the Deputy.
There's no independent oversight, for example, in terms of tracker mortgages and the offers that banks may make to people in tracker mortgages.
Deputy, you're over time now. Deputy,
in terms of making sure that the wool isn't pulled over their eye. There's no entitlement to a minimum level of income, for example.
Please.
And fundamentally, you've changed the legislation without conditions to essentially give all the power and all the control in this scenario to the banks themselves.
Sorry, Deputy Martin, I'm sorry.
Last Corla,
I'm sorry, you're over time.
I accept that, Last Corla. And may I say, Last Corla?
You have to resume it. I have to call the Minister.
Yeah, I just want to ask the Minister. There's one, if I may, and I know there's many people over the government's benches seem to be aspiring to your position now, giving you instructions and so on, you know. But I just want to ask, Minister, given what was revealed yesterday,
what's the question?
Will you change tack and ensure that there's an independent oversight in the relationship between banks and those in mortgage?
Thank you, Minister Richard Bruton. Final reply.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that there was a question in among that. It was, but one thing I'll have to say is that the Deputy Opposite doesn't seem to realise the persistent policies that led hundreds of thousands of people to buy property in the midst of a property bubble that was supported by flawed policies that your government pursued. That is the reality. We are in government trying to deal with the consequences of policies that failed. And I will answer the question.
Order, please. Order.
The question as to whether we can agree with Ulster Bank on claims, clearly we do not know the data in respect of Ulster Bank and the claims they're making. But what we have put in place is a requirement to have 50% of people who are in difficulties with sustainable solutions developed by the end of the year, and that is overseen independently by the central bank. Furthermore, the process. Furthermore, the process.
The Minister.
Furthermore, the process of banks complying with the programme, the mortgage arrears programme, the MARP, that can, if a bank fails to deal with that process and deal with those procedures, that can be appealed to the Financial Service Ombudsman. Again, their commitment to deal with the regulations as set out is overseen. And thirdly, individuals who have been unable to find agreements with their banks now have the option of going to an independent personal insolvency service where they can have those issues independently assessed and a procedure put in place to deal with their problems. So right along the trail, there's independent oversight of the different steps in this process in order to make sure that those who can pay or who can't pay are offered sustainable solutions. That is the route that we have sought to pursue. And I again say that if we fail to face up to these problems in our banks, we will have the sort of zombie problem within banking where families and banks and our economy is trapped in a situation where we can't move forward. So the actions we're taking are designed to allow a recovery come after a crisis being created by policies about which you know more about than we do.
Thank you, Minister. Now